Hello, and welcome to the Healing with Charlie podcast, where we chat about all things attachment styles, no contact, and healing. I'm your host, Charlie, and today we're chatting with Andrea Kretschmer. Andrea is a life and social worker, retired therapist, and all-around style icon based in Ohio. I first discovered Andrea as I was scrolling on TikTok. My feed is often filled with videos from other creators who demonize and degrade dismissive and disorganized attachment styles, but every once in a while a creator sharing a nuanced and neutral perspective comes along, which is why their content immediately stuck out to me. Andrea has personal experience as someone with disorganized attachment, but is also highly knowledgeable in various personality disorders. So I'm excited to have them on the show today to share all about their knowledge with us. Andrea, thank you for joining the show today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. It's exciting to have you on. And as I mentioned, like when I was on TikTok, just kind of doom scrolling, I just came across your content by mistake, by accident. You know, the algorithm wanted to share it my way. And, I get so used to seeing other content creators that have the same script where they talk about certain attachment styles and even certain personality disorders with such anger and vitriol and often a lot of misinformation. And so that's why when I saw your videos talking about it with a really nuanced and balanced perspective, like it really stood out to me. And that's why I wanted to bring you on today. So why don't you kick things off by sharing a little bit about your background, either both personally and professionally?
So as you said, I am a licensed social worker. I'm not currently working, thus a retired therapist. But yeah, I have been practicing in the field of mental health for a couple years. I have a couple niches. One of those is complex trauma that more often, as we start working together, it usually turns out it's some sort of personality disorder. I have a lot of experience working with people with BPD or like broad cluster B presentations. And yeah, I kind of came to that work because that has been my personal experience. I've been in treatment for borderline for 15 years, more or less. Some of that's been helpful, some of that hasn't been helpful, and learning about attachment in the middle of all of that academically and in my own kind of life has been a really big game changer for me. And so that's why I guess I put nuanced perspectives out on the internet as a former unhinged, crazy, harmful person who has found a lot of healing and wants nuance for other people who may fall into that category and be struggling.
Yeah, that's really great to hear because, there's a lot of people that think when it comes to like attachment styles or people with personality disorders that they very rarely even want to seek help. And even when other people push them to seek help, they very rarely go. And while I can understand that that sentiment is true for many, I don't think it naturally applies to the great spectrum that is attachment and personality disorders, because I've worked with many people who have sought help, who do try and heal and manage, their personality disorders, their attachment behaviors, and whatever shows up in their relationships. And so that leads me to kind of like my first question for you is, how did you first discover like your attachment style, your personality traits, and how did you know it was time to start seeking help? What was going on in your life at the time?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I have been in therapy since I was 6. So there's kind of always been something off or wrong. Um, I've been bounced around from therapist to therapist, in and out of like higher levels of care, residential treatment, partial hospitalization, all of these things for my entire life, more or less. And I think there was a point in time where I was really burnt out of going to therapy. I had ended my time with my adolescent therapist. She was an eating disorder practitioner, treated me for anorexia for 4 years. And when I had gone to residential treatment and more or less had the eating disorder bullied out of me. That treatment was not great or helpful in the longer term sense of things. Um, a lot of the kind of underlying issues that the eating disorder was covering up or protecting me from started to show up. And that's when I got diagnosed with bipolar, and I was like, girl, no, I don't have bipolar. My psychiatrist was like, I'm done with psychiatrists. I can't with them right now. Um, and my therapist, who had been working with me for a long time, we had previously talked about things like narcissistic wounding, vulnerable narcissism. Thought she was going to diagnose me with NPD, and I was scared
Mm.
because I was approaching the age where, at the time, like you can diagnose somebody with something like that. But we ultimately landed on borderline, and that is something that really fit. But I had aged out of her care, and this is during the kind of like beginning of the trauma and attachment revolution in general psychology and popular psychology. And so I had been in a relationship for a while, um, and I was living with my partner, and I was deeply unhinged. There was a lot of stuff going on in my personal life, like being sounding like the messiest, most traumatized person around. I'm so sorry, but like I had two heart surgeries while we were dating, and that understandably really screwed me up. Like two heart surgeries, 6 months. Like I was not feeling great. It was not a healthy relationship. So I had fallen back into some problematic behaviors, and I couldn't understand why I was acting the way that I was. Like I was like screaming at them, throwing things. We had a very unhealthy dynamic in general, and I didn't recognize myself. I felt like I had worked so hard to maintain some sort of stability, and getting in a relationship like that just threw everything off. And so then I sought out an adult therapist, and she specialized in trauma. Didn't believe in borderline, so that didn't work out well later on for me. Oops, blew up my life again. Because I really did need that kind of psychoeducation and support and a practitioner who understands that diagnosis. Because it is quite specific. It can't just be called trauma
Mm.
and expect things to go well. But yeah, during the course of that treatment, I had been in up and down relationships, abusive relationships, engaging in a lot of like promiscuous behavior. And I had kind of blown up my life in one way. And then I started working with kids. And I went back to school, originally intending to be a child therapist, um, as I was getting more stability. And I was finding a lot of healing in working with children. And this is when I learned about attachment as a layperson. And then I got to build upon that, in an academic way,
Mm.
and really integrate a lot of these like principles. And that's when I kind of figured out like, oh, I have a disorganized attachment, like to a T. Like I am a disorganized attached person. And it makes sense with this framework, this grounding theory, everything about my life. It makes sense that I hate myself and I'm scared of other people. It makes sense that I want to be with people and I also end up running away from them. Um, And so it's been interesting. That was probably 7 or 8 years ago that I started learning about these things. And it's been an interesting thing to kind of build on in my own personal recovery, um, and apply more generally to work that I do with people and to relationships and relational functioning in my life.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really incredible story, especially since you started in this space so young, right? And
Mm-hmm.
of course, there's ways in which we add to the challenges in our life, whether it's through our actions or
Mm-hmm.
the things that we do in our relationships. But granted, some of those things that happened in your life were largely out of your control, like needing to have
Mm-hmm.
double heart surgery, right? And it's easy to assume that something like that would have an effect on someone. But it's another thing to
Mm-hmm.
truly grasp and understand what that effect means on a core level,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like people listening and watching, they might be thinking, yeah, of course someone would have a hard time going through that. But when you actually go through it, you start to see how it impacts not just you, but your relationships. And that's really what you touched
Mm-hmm.
upon, because sometimes things happen and you don't have an explanation. And even if you can explain it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it
Mm-hmm.
makes sense to you in the sense that you can control it, right? Because you're in a point in your life where largely a lot is out of your control. And I think that's something a lot of people with disorganized attachment can resonate with. I know, speaking on my experience with disorganized attachment before I started doing my own healing work, I thought that was just normal, right? I thought life was just like that
Mm-hmm.
and this is the way people are. And then it's interesting that when you started working with children and learning about, like early childhood education and, of course, attachment, that your world kind of started to make a little bit more sense. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, in my work, working with other people who start learning about this stuff, they all kind of explain the light bulb moment where everything just clicks and then they start analyzing everything about their past. And so I'm kind of
Mm-hmm.
curious, up until that point, how did you view life and love differently? Because naturally, when you start to learn about attachment, you start to do an audit on your past life, your
Mm-hmm.
relationships. And when you start to move forward, you begin to view yourself differently. So I'm kind of curious, given all the work that you've done, how has your self image or perception of yourself changed from that moment before and afterward?
Yeah. So I want to offer a little bit of kind of like academic perspective when it comes to attachment, and then I'll try to integrate that into my experience. But like, so when we think about something like disorganized attachment, we're thinking about a working model of the self that is negative and fearful, and a working model of others that is negative and fearful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, unfortunately, generally speaking, like when we start to work on disorganized attachment, one of those things tends to improve more than the other. And for disorganized people, generally improving the working model of others is a little bit more accessible and a little bit more stable over time. While I have a more compassionate view of myself now, I think my view of others is improving as would be
Mm-hmm.
expected, a little bit better. Um, it's tough. I definitely don't, spend all day hating myself anymore, but there are certain things like that just make it so difficult. It's so kind of hardwired into me. And I think that will be like my lifelong practice of trying to find a balance of healing my view of others and of myself simultaneously. But I am not super optimistic about the view of myself. And I think that's okay. I think that's realistic. I can do what I can. Um, but I no longer believe that I am inherently unlovable. I don't believe that there's something, or I do believe it, but I'm not convinced. Like, it doesn't feel like this deep down conviction that I am broken and unlovable anymore. And I think that is the gift of doing attachment focused work and learning to trust other people, because I never got to have that positive internalized experience of seeing myself reflected in somebody else in a way that was honest and true and about me and not about the other person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, my brain just got scrambled that way. And so doing that as an adult like takes time. But I'm very fortunate now to be in like very loving and understanding relationships where I can put attachment theory to work, right? And it doesn't have to become this like deeply analytical thing. Sometimes like I'm just like, I'm dysregulated. What do I do about
Mm-hmm.
this? And it was in my last relationship um, that I just was like stricken with fear, didn't want to burden my partner, was inconsolable on my own. I couldn't regulate myself. And I was like, what if I just need to be snuggled? Question mark. is that all I need? And that was all I needed.
Yeah.
And I asked for it. And my ex was like, yeah, like I'm wrapping up dinner with friends. Like, can I like call you when I get home? You can come over. And I'm like, it could be that simple. There's no analysis needed necessarily. I'm just like, I just need a hug. I'm just a baby inside. I just need a hug.
Yeah, that's really great that you mentioned that, because in my experience working with people, as they start to open up about, their attachment styles or their ex's attachment styles, it's often through the lens of like high analysis, right? There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
scrutiny at play, and kind of like, as you said, it's through a negative lens and perception that is deeply influenced by their recent experience. And naturally so, I often work with people who are going through breakups. And,
Mm-hmm.
that's just when most people learn about attachment styles, not because they want to learn about themselves, but because they want to understand what their ex is going through. And while it's great to learn about attachment styles in that way, it really is like a individual experience in that sense, where it's like you really got to focus on yourself in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also important to consider the relationships as well, because, and I
Mm-hmm.
feel like this is prominent in Western culture particularly, there's a strong push for hyper individualism and sort of this
Mm-hmm.
new age spirituality that really tells people that they need to love themselves first before they can have love with
Mm-hmm.
anyone else, which is a myth. I think you and I are on the same page there, but
Objectively
objectively
false.
false. And, I get a lot of pushback on social media from this sometimes, because although I'm not advocating for anybody to be in unhealthy relationships, when you're in a relationship that challenges you and really puts your attachment style to the test, those are opportunities to grow and heal equally,
Mm-hmm.
provided both people are working on that together. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious, like, now that you've been doing the work for an extended amount of time and you've been able to realize, like, sometimes it's not about rationalizing why we have these core wounds. Sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
just about being held and loved. How
Mm-hmm.
has your relationships changed since you've been doing this work?
Um, I mean, I feel like I've had three relationships since doing the work because I did believe for a while that I was dangerous, like a dangerous person to be in a relationship with, which like for a period of time I was,
Mhm.
and I'm not gonna lie about that. I was kind of scary, or just like neglectful or like dismissive, and like then I would run away and be like, ah, I'm scared. I don't care about your feelings. I'm so scared right now. Um, but like you know, the first relationship I was in right out of the gate, I feel like I was in that analytical space and I didn't know how to put any of it into practice. And it ultimately wasn't like a good, safe fit for me. I ended up withdrawing quite a lot. And I think I learned to actually listen to my avoidance rather than try to fight it.
Mhm.
I was like, well, what is my avoidance telling me? What is my withdrawal telling me? And I was able to like actually for once effectively end a relationship. There's nothing like a lesbian breakup that lasts 4 hours and makes like sure everybody gets heard to like make you feel like you have advanced in so far as not ghosting people anymore. Just like I can sit with this difficult situation in which I am hurting somebody's feelings and it will be okay.
Mhm.
I don't have to run away. I can be honest and things will work out. And then my last two relationships like have definitely been very healthy. My ex and I broke up because he finished his PhD and had to move across the country, and I was like, I cannot move across the country to expensive land, aka the Bay Area. Um, and we weren't together long enough for me to feel like that was a wise choice. Even though we do really love each other, we're still friends. I've been able to maintain that relationship with a new set of kind of parameters and boundaries, and we still very much care about each other. Um, and, that's the first relationship in which I was really able to accept my needs as being something important. Um, and things that I could ask for. And I think it also helps that he is like incredibly blunt and very autistic and would just call me out and be like, did I make you cry? And I'm like, no. He's like, well, you're crying in the bathroom by yourself and avoiding me. So can we talk about it? And I'm like, So it's like this person who like, even though they weren't like the emotionally the warmest because of their neurotype, right? And like their background, like they were still able to just be like, I care about you. Can you please tell me what's going on? Like you're acting weird. I'm like, are you sure? And he's like, I'm sure. And then he's like, do you want me to like hold you? And I'm like, yeah, actually, that would be really helpful, I think. Got to co-regulate while I tell you my crazy thoughts about how I cried because you said my breath stinks and you just requested that I go use some mouthwash. You know, and now in my current relationship, like my partner is this predominantly securely attached person, but definitely has like a decent amount of avoidance. And so I find when I'm in relationships with people who are more avoidant, more of my preoccupation comes out.
Right.
Um, like, and so that's been an interesting thing to kind of navigate. And luckily, my partner is like soft, squishy, emotional, can't always express what they need. And so we've had some difficult conversations around that, how we communicate in our partnership, things that I think are acceptable forms of communication, and like how we can support one another in our kind of like deficits. The things that we struggle with has been really great. But yeah, I don't really question with in the context of my current relationship, having had these other experiences now, um, that like my needs are silly. I can be really honest about things. I've been able to pretty immediately express when I'm uncomfortable because I've learned that I'm really bad at hiding it.
Yeah.
um, my emotions are incredibly visible. I don't have as many defenses against not emoting as I used to. And so I kind of feel like a raw nerve a lot of the time, whereas I used to be like overly controlled with suppressing my feelings and just not telling anybody anything, and just isolating a lot. And so it's been so lovely to just like have partners that are very perceptive and they're like, hey, something's off. And I'm like, are you sure? And they're like, yeah, you're like literally crying. And I'm like, okay, you're right. Here's how what I'm thinking and feeling.
Hmm.
And then I've been able to communicate that and have that be received. And I feel cared for in those moments.
That's great.
It's like I have, yeah, it's so nice. It's so lovely.
Yeah. That's
Um,
really amazing. Like I think one of the common themes
mhm,
I've picked up on throughout that whole experience is just like how fluid your attachment style can be from person to person,
mhm,
relationship to relationship, and how sometimes having those insecure attachment traits isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? There's a
mhm,
lot of information in media that promotes this idea that unless you're secure, you have flaws, and those flaws are somehow inherently bad. And this
mhm,
is a great part of my work is that sometimes there are certain traits and qualities about having an insecure attachment style that are good. It's not about fixing everything about you and your attachment style.
mhm,
It is really about addressing the key problem areas that can create a lot of friction and conflict and disconnect within those relationships. But, you
mhm,
know, being attuned to someone, the same thing can apply to a secure attacher, an anxious attacher, or someone with anxious preoccupied attachment, or in your case someone who was avoidant but more secure, right? They were still
mhm,
attuned to you. They could pick up when you were maybe
mhm,
upset by something. And I think this is all great to hear because a lot of people don't get to hear from someone who is actively doing the work and who has real world experiences and they're willing to share, right? And there's a huge misconception on social media that avoidants never do the work. They never go and seek help, or they don't even think that they have a problem. And many of them deep down think that they do. They may not be able to pinpoint
mhm,
it, but many of them are
mhm,
aware that something is not right sometimes. And so it's refreshing. And this is why I'm glad I invited
mhm,
you on, because it's the very thing I picked up on your content. And I can see why you've been growing at
mhm,
the rate that you have been on social media. Um, the other question I wanted to ask is, now that you kind of have more security in your relationships, what are some of the ways or strategies that you're implementing to foster even more security to keep those relationships flourishing?
yeah. So in my current like romantic partnership, my partner has started therapy this year. they hadn't had health insurance for a while, so it's been kind of like difficult to get in. But they've never been to therapy before. But they're when we come up against things that in the past I have maybe overstepped in my relationship, and especially because I'm in the mental health field, right? Like, I don't want to be my partner's
Right.
therapist. And that's like a boundary that, as a new therapist, that I need to um, figure out and maintain. And so there are situations in which, like, my partner and I will experience some sort of conflict. And because they are a little bit less aware of their emotional experience, because they're a little more avoidant, because they have kind of textbook avoidant fears of, like, well, I don't matter. Nobody cares about me. Nobody wants to hear about anything I have to say, so I'll just keep it to myself. You know, they have trouble communicating, and they may want to communicate something in a way that I can't tolerate with my level of anxiety and, like, you know, issues around attachment. And we've had to, like, kind of troubleshoot, like, hey, I can't have like a discussion that's serious over text. I love you, I care about you, I want to talk with you. This produced a lot of stress for me, and I don't feel like we resolved the issue. I feel like I have a better understanding of what's going on for you now. Is this something you would be comfortable exploring with your therapist next time you meet? Like, drawing those kind of boundaries around conflict as it comes up. Or, sometimes I can be really sensitive to any sort of criticism or feeling like I've done something wrong. Or the other day, we were just like play fighting on my couch, and I like poked them too hard in the ribs, and like they were like, ouch, don't do that. And I was like, oh no, you're gonna leave me. I knew I was a piece of shit. Like, and so, granted, this was also the day I started my period, so context dependent. That's when
Yep.
I'm probably at my lowest as far as, like, it all just flares up. The BPD symptoms, the attachment insecurity, it's just loud. But, even in those moments, like, my partner can understand, it's like, oh, this is like touching on, like, Andrea's attachment stuff. This is important for me to tend to in these moments. Or, you know, they're very good at adapting to situations and showing up. And also, as you were saying, it's not that I have to be perfect or they have to be perfect. Neither of us is probably ever going to be fully secure, right? But we are kind of joined in moving towards security together.
Hmm.
And I think that's what's important. And as long as we're both able to, at our present capacity, advocate for what we need or assist each other in kind of sussing out what we need, right? And prioritizing our connection, then that's all you can ask for, right?
Right.
And these are strategies that I use with friends. My best friend is like hella anxiously attached. And it's also something I use with my mom. My mom is pretty dismissive and avoidant, and she has like almost no emotional depth. And so these are strategies that I try to employ with her as well, and things I keep in front of my mind in all manner of relationships, personal and professional. I just think it's such a helpful way to approach things, where I am prioritizing the connection. I am aware of people's sensitivities. Um, and I am carrying that into my interactions with them to the best of my ability, and not running away or shutting them out when things get scary.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned the approach you take, not just for your romantic partnership, but like with your friendships and with your family,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like with the rising popularity of pop psychology, a lot of the emphasis is really focused on romantic
Mm-hmm.
relationships. And there are a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people who want to know now, not just how to apply this to their romantic ones, but like how they can manage their attachment wounds in the workplace, or how they can do that just day to day, going out in public and interacting with
Mm-hmm.
strangers, or trying to make friends for the first time at a party. And then, of course, sometimes when they're dealing with dismissive parents, I feel like many people can relate
Mm-hmm.
to having dismissive parents in some sense. And
Mm-hmm.
it's great you share that, because there's a lot of misconceptions about attachment styles, where they start and end, and where the overlap is with some other issues or some other character traits that we've kind of talked about so far, like BPD or bipolar disorder. And so I'm kind of curious, maybe we can talk a little bit about that, your experience with bipolar or BPD and anywhere else. And maybe you can explain, like, what is BPD and how does it impact people's lives generally?
Yeah. Okay, I just want to say I have no personal experience with bipolar. This was a misdiagnosis before I got
Yes.
diagnosed with BPD. Classic story. A lot of people with cluster B disorders are misdiagnosed with bipolar, but a lot of people, particularly with borderline, are also on the bipolar kind of spectrum of
Right.
things. About like 1 in 5, we could confidently assert. Um, but yeah. Can you actually repeat the question?
Yeah.
I got
Yeah.
caught up in my disclaimer
No.
because they're often confused. So I'm
Yeah.
like, let's not confuse
No,
them.
it's an important distinction to make, right? Because they are often mistaken for each other. But I'm
Mhm.
curious, like, what was your experience with BPD? And maybe you can explain to just the general listeners and viewers who may not even know what borderline personality disorder even is. Like, maybe you could explain what that is and how it typically shows up in those people's lives.
Yeah, so that's kind of a tricky thing, like, because borderline is people with BPD are not a monolith. Um, and we can see so many different presentations of borderline people with different comorbidities. And so I always try to offer that disclaimer. Like, I am not a stereotypical case of borderline. I think the stereotype is like somebody who is like highly anxiously attached, who is like splitting, constantly saying their partner is all good or all bad, that they're abusive or manipulative. Like that is the kind of trope of the disorder, and that is a presentation that we see. But there's so much nuance in how borderline can present. So in kind of like layman's terms or in a shorter sense, borderline is a pervasive disorder beginning at least in early adulthood, although the foundation starts much younger than that, characterized by an unstable pattern of relationships, characterized by idealization, devaluation, or like what we would call splitting. At the core of that is this kind of like fear of abandonment and kind of unresolved attachment trauma. And then you're also going to see a lot of unstable affect. So I would call this emotion dysregulation. People are moody in a pervasive sense, not like with bipolar where they're manic and then depressed. It's like they're moody all of the time. They have trouble regulating their emotions. And then you also see a lot of impulsivity.
Mm.
So those are kind of like the broad strokes, but there's also a lot of self-injurious behavior, chronic feelings of emptiness. It's a really big and enduring symptoms. And then like dissociation, suicidal threats, gestures, etc.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, in the way that I kind of conceptualize these things, it's like definitely a lot of that is in orbit around the core issue of the attachment trauma. That's how I kind of view it. But there is like biological basis for it as well.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. And I'm glad you made the distinction between how it's often misdiagnosed in the earliest stages.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to maybe NPD or narcissistic personality disorder, is there a certain criteria or number of traits that someone has to meet before they're technically considered borderline?
Yeah, it's 5 of the 9.
5 of the 9. Wow.
And yeah, and that has to be in a pervasive manner beginning in early adulthood. But we also can diagnose in adolescence. We can and do and should.
Right.
If people are meeting all the criteria in adolescence, it's best that they get treated for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Otherwise, they'll end up like me or
Yeah.
worse. Ah.
Well, hopefully not. And in terms of like, because there's a lot of misconceptions about this, right? Especially with it not being so widely understood. And on top of that, not even as widely discussed online. What are some things about BPD that you wish people understood better?
Um, all of it, honestly.
Yeah.
I, I really want people to understand that it's not just a stand-in for like my crazy abusive ex-girlfriend disorder. Like that's not what it is.
Hmm.
And the same thing happens like my ex-boyfriend was a narcissist, and I know that I'm like, okay, we need to take a step back with the armchair diagnosing of people. Both of these are relatively rare conditions,
Right.
like to meet all of the criteria and to meet all of the criteria and have it cause enough dysfunction and distress in your life that we would call it a disorder. Like that's rare.
Yeah.
Um, it's like a lot of these things are human traits. And so we may have some of these traits. We may be a little bit on the borderline spectrum. We may be a little bit narcissistic. These are just human things. And for some complex number of reasons, people throughout their early experience of life had to rely on these traits that were just available to all of us at one point. And so I don't want people to view people with borderline or borderline traits or narcissistic personality style traits, etc., as if they're some sort of inhuman evil and that you need to like really train your eye to spot them and protect yourself against them by externalizing and finding issue with them,
Right.
rather than reflecting on oneself, and learning to be compassionate and boundaried.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's like the general gist of what I just wish people could understand is like people with borderline and like narcissistic personality or even people with like antisocial personality, they're not out here just like plotting to hurt you and destroy your life. Like, that's not what's happening by and large.
By and large, yeah. And I'm
Um,
glad you mentioned that
yeah.
because obviously, with some of the more mainstream psychologists, especially the ones who focus on these, they can have a very dark view and message about
Mm-hmm.
even particularly NPD. And although I won't
Mm-hmm.
name any psychologists in particular,
Don't worry, I named them on my TikTok
yeah.
recently. Go check it out if you want the slander.
Exactly. It's really alarming how like a society generally places a bias or a preference towards people in positions of authority or knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And rightfully so. Like
Mm-hmm.
there are people who have degrees who are very knowledgeable, but
Mm-hmm.
for some people, they can have blind faith in those degrees as
Mm-hmm.
like the truth. Then it's completely
Mm-hmm.
unbiased because this person is educated and studied. And that is simply sometimes not the case. Like many times, people
Mm-hmm.
who are often in the forefront of the conversation when it comes to, say, borderline or narcissism, they have their own motivations behind why they send a certain message, whether it's they're pushing a course or they're trying to peddle a book, right? And I think more people should really be questioning, this when they come across content that is so divisive and very one-sided or one-dimensional in that way. Because
Mm-hmm.
working with people who are going through attachment healing, they explain that all the time when it comes to avoidance and fearful avoidance. If I had $1 for every time someone called them evil, I wouldn't have to work anymore, right? And
Yeah.
it's pretty alarming because it creates this imbalance, I feel, within
Mm-hmm.
the healing space, because it indirectly says that people with certain attachment styles or personality disorders are better than others, right? And that's just
Mm-hmm.
simply not the case. Anybody who really does learn about this stuff and studies it and has a nuanced perspective understands that they're all equal in their own right. They don't inherently make a person bad. And it's just a matter of perspective at the end of the day, right? And so with that, you and I, we're both doing the Lord's work in that sense. We are trying to destigmatize personality disorders and attachment styles, but it comes with a lot of pushback. And so I'm curious, what kind of inspired you to shape your content in this way? Because it's an intentional choice at the end of the day, right? What kind of inspired you to really take that stance and to stand up for people who are often, mislabeled or stigmatized?
I think it's something that I have always kind of believed, but have recently developed more language and competency to discuss. And so this is the thing where I have always been of the belief that people are not like inherently evil. Like I believe it's wild given my attachment insecurity and how much I'm scared of people that I still believe in the inherent goodness of people. And I don't know if this comes from like my faith background, but you know, like I would be lying if I said like it wasn't like coming into my mind when I'm working with people who are like screaming at me, yelling at me, like as clients, right? And it's my job to hold space for them and to give like a corrective experience for them to say, like, forgive them for they know not what they do, right? It's like this is a defense. And this can be this kind of dynamic of like when I'm working with clients who are incredibly reactive in the attachment sense of like this is a close relationship and they feel safe enough to kind of lash out at me. I'm like, okay, let's roll with it. And I think there's like a collective version of that happening where people have been drawn into this larger paradigm in which people are relying on emotional kind of manipulation and eliciting people's primitive defenses to create a bad other or a scapegoat, right? Um, and I don't always think people have insight into how they're being radicalized by certain people who are not interested genuinely in their well being as much as they are in lining their
Right.
pockets, um, or feeding their own ego or getting something out of it that does not benefit people in a humanistic sense. I think at my core, I am a humanist. I want everybody to have space to feel seen, have their experience reflected back to them. I want us all to heal more collectively, and that's not done through scapegoating. That has never been a great defense for us as humans. That is a very primitive and regressive kind of thing to do. And I don't say primitive in the term of like uncultured. I mean it in the sense of like morally.
Right.
It is morally a bit primitive. And I think for people who have been hurt, it makes a lot of sense. There's a period in time where we really need to see the people who have hurt us as bad. That anger, that fear, that is a signal to get to safety. That is not a place to live for the rest of our lives and cast aspersions on entire groups of people based on anecdotal experience and being fed morally dubious claims by people who don't have your best interest in mind.
Right.
Like it really bothers me. And I feel like, I have always in some way had this capacity to view the larger context. And it's been nice to find more people who are also witnessing these phenomena that are as old as time. Like these are not new phenomena. Finding a bad person or a bad group is not a new concept. It's a dangerous one though. And so I have been enjoying stepping into community where we can hold space and share language and strategy to dismantle some of that, to introduce people to a more nuanced perspective, and also to meet people where they are. Because I don't think people are acting this way because it doesn't make sense to them. It makes sense to them,
Mm-hmm.
but they might not know that it's not a healthy place to be for the rest of their lives.
Right. Yeah.
Like those parts of them that are protecting them and keeping other people bad don't have to work so hard
Yeah.
anymore
Yeah.
if they're safe.
Yeah. I think you
We can give them tools so they don't have to work so hard.
exactly. Yeah.
It's like, I see you got a little hammer. Have you considered that you might need a construction team?
I like the way you put that because I was just about to say, like, I think you hit the nail right on the head. It's really a give and take relationship with like social media, coaches, and therapists who are at the forefront of a lot of this content online. And when people who are less informed or in a really vulnerable place where they're just able to soak up a lot of this information, they can sometimes be fed a lot of misinformation, a lot of biased information, and some information that's slanted to fit a certain narrative that they don't realize is actually harmful to adopt. Because it becomes like a
Mhm.
seed and it grows. And when you start to view one particular group in this way, you take that same model and apply it to others. And it's really important, I feel, for personality disorders and attachment styles equally to not be viewed and hyper generalized based purely on a label
Mhm.
and what people are talking about online, right? It's really important for people to make up their own opinion. And I want to say, like, with the great portion of people that I work with, they don't fit into that category. They equally acknowledge that I
Mhm.
share this message, and they also want to sometimes share that when they watch this content, for example, people going through breakups and they see other people saying that avoidants are evil or that they never love them and they don't care about them, that doesn't make them feel any better, right? It doesn't make them
Mhm.
feel
It's
good. And it's a
it's
shame.
disempowering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really
It is.
hurtful.
Yeah. And the one thing that I've been kind of talking about a little bit more publicly recently is that when people, I'm just going to say this is like this, it gives cult vibes. It's the cult of narcissists are bad. The cult of the other is bad, right?
Right.
And, you know, like when people are indoctrinated into these things and radicalized more or less, just like we see in any other kind of system that like behaves this way, like these spaces don't allow for complexity and nuance. And one thing that I think is really devastating about this is if we're going around diagnosing our moms, our sisters, our exes, anybody, our boss, if we're giving everybody these diagnoses, we're making our world really small, and it kind of reinforces that this is a good thing to be doing. And it doesn't allow us to have any nuanced thinking about people who may be important to us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or may have been important to us. Just because my family wasn't great doesn't mean I don't have great memories of them. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean I don't love them. It doesn't mean that I can't adjust my behavior within my control to have a safe and boundaried relationship with them as an adult. There are people in my life and my past who I will never talk to again because they have hurt me so much that it's not safe for me to speak to them. Or, and people feel that way about me, right? But I still acknowledge that I at one point loved that person.
Mm-hmm.
I have warm feelings toward that person. That person was charming and charismatic and also full of hatred of themselves. And that's why they behave that way. I don't have to hate them more than I once loved them to have safe distance from them.
Right.
I don't have to, that can be within my control, and I can hold the nuance of how I feel about that. And I don't have to put everything through the lens of this person was actually evil. Like, I don't think anybody that has hurt me is evil. I truly don't at my core. I don't think that is something that exists in human form. I think it's a human idea, but you know, nobody in my life fits that category, even though they have done pretty objectionable and harmful things to me.
Yeah.
Um, I think we lose out on that nuance when people are radicalized in this way, that it just shuts people down. And, from the way that I tend to like approach therapy with clients, and this is part of the work that I do as a therapy client, is like we make space for all parts of us.
Right.
Like all parts are welcome. There's a part of me that loved that person who hurt me so badly. That's okay.
Yeah.
There's another part of me that hates them and like wants harm to come to them. And then there's the core of me who knows that neither of those things is balanced on its own. And that I, at the core of who I am, can respond effectively to that situation when it comes up, when I have these memories, good or bad, you know? And I think making space for that more nuanced kind of view of things can be so much more helpful than dying on the hill of narcissists and avoidance and my toxic ex are all evil monster people.
Yeah. Yeah. I resonate with that deeply because in my work, I commonly see, of course, people who are going through breakups with avoidance, they're very hurt. They're deeply
Mhm.
vulnerable and they feel abandoned. Some of them will even go as so far to say that they've been discarded. Um, and when I'm in those sessions with people, I don't judge. I don't try to educate them. And that sometimes, maybe you have harmful thinking because, it's just a natural part of going through a breakup, right?
Mhm.
No one can really have
Mhm.
control over the emotions that come up. They just have to honor them. And so
Mhm.
what I worry about sometimes is with there is a bit of a culture war taking place within healing right now,
Mhm.
where it is creating a sense of divisiveness amongst, shifting over to attachment styles. Like it's anxious people versus avoidance, or anybody else who's dated an avoidant versus the avoidant and fearful avoidant. And it's almost like
Mhm.
splitting the sides between
Mhm.
two teams in a way. And it doesn't have to be like that. I don't think it can be a neutral
Mhm.
balance. Like I see attachment styles as fluid, and I've worked with
Mhm.
some anxious attachers who at one point had very damaging and harmful views about avoidance, only to then realize how truly harmful it can be to date someone who is deeply anxiously preoccupied in a very severe sense. And so I
Yeah.
really want to get your opinion on this because I think you have some great insight here. Because there's a lot of anxious attachers or people who have dated avoidance that think because avoidance shy away from conflict and can't communicate, that somehow makes everyone else who dates them inherently better because they can communicate. But there's another side of this that's often missed with, sometimes anxious attachers, they don't necessarily always communicate in the best way. They are
Mhm.
deeply dysregulated as well. And so, what are some things you could share to maybe some anxious attachers or even securely attached people who feel slighted by avoidance to help them view the other side with a little bit more empathy, with a little bit more understanding, even to maybe see how maybe the anxious attachers can be equally harmful? Like, how could we tip the scales or balance the scales in your mind?
Mhm. Yeah. So what kind of comes to mind, and I don't want this to sound dismissive, like I promise it's helpful.
Yeah.
Um, it's like when I introduce the concept of radical acceptance to people. I'm like, whoa, that doesn't mean everything in life is like good. Don't bypass with this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's not meant to be a dismissive tool, but just because something feels real doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
Um, so what can really happen, and on this kind of severe end of preoccupation, we would usually see something like borderline or some sort of personality pathology, if given the right mix of experiences, right? Um, what can happen is that things all get viewed through the lens of the intensity of the emotion. And so they can feel really, really true. Um, like if we can project a narrative onto that. And this is something that I have had to sort through with my own kind of behavior and beliefs and, distorted beliefs around what people are actually doing. Um, but I think for preoccupied people who are in relationship with avoidantly attached people, because the avoidant person is touching on one of their primordial fears, right? Like we are born with the fear of abandonment, and preoccupied people fear abandonment in a deeply visceral way. Like it is horrifying to fear that somebody is going to leave you. Um, and since avoidant people activate this fear, the emotion of the fear can distort what is happening in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
And that can lead to a lot of really uncomfortable behavior, right? When I was in an unhealthy relationship with a preoccupied person, they would follow me around. They would violate my express boundaries and then get really upset when I would leave. So it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy if we can't learn to acknowledge that emotion, right? And sit with it and regulate before acting, right? Because the act in and of itself or the indirect communication, passive aggression, etc., that might come out of that pain, of that need being threatened, the need to not be abandoned, right? The need to remain connected. Um, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can directly lead to what the person fears most. And that is so challenging. And it feels, and I feel like I'm stuttering a little bit trying to explain this because I'm actually afraid of how anxious people have responded to me in the
Right.
past, where they say I'm treating the avoidant person preferentially rather than taking a longer view of the entire dynamic.
Right.
This sense of urgency, this panic, this fear that drives people to act in ways that don't factor in the consent or boundaries of the avoidant person, who have those boundaries probably because they're trying to maintain safety in the relationship. Um, you know, I'm taking the longer view of recognizing that this is part of the pattern. And there are things that can be implemented in that. And I think people unfortunately see it as this like all or nothing tug of war type thing, where it's like, no, I'm not preferentially like treating the avoidant person. I am trying to make sure everybody stays safe.
Mm-hmm.
Here are some strategies that might help, right? Um, but yeah, I got like kind of weird because I was scared. I was like, oh no, I don't want to come across as like the worst person ever, or like I'm scared of how people will react, because I've straight up had people tell me that I shouldn't exist.
Yep. Me too.
Because, and I'm like, what is going on
Yeah.
in this here world where you're saying the vast majority of insecurely attached people should not exist? Like, what in the eugenics is happening here?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good point you touch upon, because on one side with avoidance, you have people, generally speaking, that avoid conflict. Whereas you have on the other side anxious preoccupation, which often motivates people to seek safety via action, but sometimes that action can be deeply harmful, deeply toxic and abusive. And when I talk about this on social media, I often get people in comments or wherever else saying that, well, even if someone is anxiously attached and they're that deeply abusive, it must be explained by something else. They must have something else going on that can explain why they react in that way. But when I talk about dismissive avoidance in the same way, nobody questions it deeper, right? They're just happy with the fact that, yep, they're avoidant. That explains it. And if they do something that's reactively abusive, it's because they're avoidant. But there's more grace and understanding and flexibility given to the anxious side, which I feel is deeply unfair, because many people do not realize what it is like to go through a really harmful and abusive relationship with someone who is anxiously preoccupied until they're in that position. And I'm not saying that all anxious, preoccupied people are like this. Again, it is a spectrum. But with the spectrum comes those who are, not so anxious and those that are severely anxious. And it's really deeply unfair how we can refer to all avoidance as the small 5% who are severely avoidant, but then we refer to the anxious side as the majority that is not abusive. And they're just the types to go through relationships with avoidance, and they're anxious because they're dating avoidance, which I think is also unfair to put on avoidantly attached people in some ways, because I've spoken with securely attached people who have dated all attachment styles, and many of them all have their preferences. But what I have seen the most is that they would rather date someone who is either secure or avoidant than someone who is anxious. Now, of course, that's just my experience in working with those securely attached people. However, it really does say something about, in the privacy of a session that I have with people like that, how confident they are to share that. But you don't see people sharing that confidently online because of the reactive backlash that you're often exposed to. Especially as a content creator, I can understand your hesitation with wanting to share about that, because, when you're making content online, you are just making something, you're putting it out there, and that's it. It's out of your control.
Mm-hmm.
How people will interpret that is entirely up to them. And it doesn't matter how you shape your content, how you script it, how you word it, somebody is always going to be unhappy, right? And
Yeah.
that's the really hard line to walk on when you're talking about attachment styles, because the anxiously attached people, they're going to be the types to leave a comment more, more aggressively, even more willingly. In general, I find anxiously attached people are more engaging in the comment sections than the avoidant people. And I've had some videos where I've seen groups of anxiously attached people just verbally berate people who have other perspectives and other opinions just because it doesn't align with theirs. And it is truly an interesting time to be a content creator in this space, because what I don't think people realize is, like, at the center of it all is shame. How we view each attachment style can sometimes be looked at through the lens of shame. And shame is a really interesting topic to me, because a lot of people don't realize that the way they communicate is an extension of shame, whether it's internalized shame or shame with how they view other people. And shame is a big part in shaping personality disorders and insecure attachment. And it's interesting because when you study the practice in the field of therapy, historically, people used to experience shame because they were in therapy. And now it's almost like people are shaming other people to go to therapy. And you see it a lot in videos where they talk about avoidant attachment, where they say, simply go get help before you hurt other people. Just get your insurance card and go seek therapy. It's like, first of all, that's
not that guy. Not that guy.
It's deeply offensive. It's deeply dismissive.
It's so classist.
It's very classist.
Like,
right?
Come on now.
And it's almost tone deaf to the point that they don't understand the world and the economy that we're in right now, where therapy is not easily accessible for everyone. And sure, there are going to be people who say, like, you can start reading content online. You can start getting books. That's great, but that's dangerous too, right? Because you're trying to heal in a vacuum where you're at the vulnerability of someone else's agenda that they're pushing. Whereas when you're working with a therapist, you have the capacity for them to share different perspectives from the things that they've learned. And although therapists can be biased as well, they have actual knowledge and they're trained to be as unbiased as they possibly can. Right. And so I'm kind of curious. Sort of. Yeah. I won't say this applies to all of them.
I have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah. Because I've seen my fair share of therapists who have had strong opinions that you would be like, you're a therapist and you think like that. That's interesting. But I'm curious, from your perspective, when it comes to shame and like social stigma, if you could imagine a world where this didn't exist, how do you think this would impact people with personality disorders or insecure attachment and how they seek help?
It's hard for me to even imagine because I'm like, the current state of affairs is not a great thing.
It's a big question. I know.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, we would have to have so many like foundational changes, like how we're educated, how we support families for any of this to happen. And I just think by the point we had no stigma, we would be as close to a utopia as I could imagine.
Right.
But to go in reverse, like utopia is not gonna happen first.
No.
I think one of the most important things, and this was something that I would work on with families as well, when I was still actively seeing clients, is, a lot of parents would immediately turn to criticism of their kids who were really going through it. And one of the principles I would try to instill in meetings with parents is like, what happened to curiosity over criticism? Is there a way that you can take that criticism and have an internal curiosity about why you think that, and an external curiosity for your child to promote connection and understanding? And I think this unfortunately, people who were hurt or traumatized or have attachment insecurity really struggle with not only nuance, but having enough space to let their guard down, to be curious. Like being curious and playful and compassionate doesn't exist within these parts of us that are protecting or defending us, right? Like I would argue that's like the core of who we are. And so if we're able to take some time to get to know ourselves and to reflect on what parts of me are like defending myself. Like, when am I leaning into criticism? Where do I hear this voice in my head? Like, where did it come from? Why does it come out of my mouth sometimes?
Hmm.
I think uh, we would be in such a better place if we gave people enough safety and space to explore these things and had enough support around these things. I would love to see that is just like a general practice, but in particular, when it comes to these fundamental issues that happen in our personalities and relationships. Um, because so often, and this would happen when I was working with couples too, they would get lost in the kind of like extraneous details of a
Right.
conflict. I'm like, where did we even start with this? Like, I feel like I'm getting receipts upon receipts upon receipts. We're getting lost here. And just inviting them back to the moment to take a breath. What are you feeling? What are you needing? I'm hearing this person doesn't understand how you feel, and they didn't even know you needed that. Is there a way we can both meet each other's needs in this moment? What does that look like? And so, how do we recognize when we're spinning out into these ideas and putting people on trial rather than coming back to the foundational? How are you feeling? How can I help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, that's my dream world.
Mine too.
It's my dream world.
Mine too. I agree.
It's so much easier too.
Yeah.
It's so much easier. I don't like drama. Even if someone texts me in all caps, I'm like, oh God, what did I do? And they're like, no, I was joking. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like it is utopian in that sense to think of a world where shame isn't often a strategy or a tactic to motivate people to change. And like you see this a lot in like I recently went down the rabbit hole of tough love, the concept of tough love. And people, they often
Not
think
the
like,
Synanon cult.
yeah, it's amazing how much time has changed and how much time has passed in between now and then that people just accept tough love as a principle of just being really stern or being really brutally honest. But I think it's really important for people to understand that when we talk about ideas of tough love, they are extensions of shame, which were deeply rooted in billion-dollar industries that are designed to abuse and deconstruct people, to inject them with ideas that they may not naturally have. It's deeply rooted in religious manipulation. It's deeply rooted in psychological coercion. And those are really touchy subjects for a lot of people. And I don't think people realize like the troubled teen industry, it still exists, right? Even in Ohio, it's a really popular industry there, right? And I recently went down that rabbit hole of like just understanding. It was like a shower thought, like, where did the concept of tough love even come from? And I was on Reddit boards, I was watching videos, I was reading books, and I didn't realize it started as like a way to help addicts recover from, addiction, but they used shame as a tool and a modality to break them down, to get them to see the error in their ways. And then it often pushed them down the pipeline of, religion and joining the church and becoming a member of that community. And in some ways it's really predatory. Now, I'm not commenting on religion, just that application of religion where it's deeply unhealthy, right?
I'm not the type of Christian that's gonna get like my panties in a bunch because you criticize abusive
Exactly.
sects of Christianity.
Yeah.
Because I'm just like, man, I don't think our dude Yeshua would really like any of this. I'm just going out on a limb here. I don't think some of y'all read what he was saying, and I have questions, comments, and concerns.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really interesting like how people accept these as like everyday beliefs that are not rooted in trauma, not rooted in abuse. And that's kind of what I try to do with my platform, is to like educate people, because I try to be, you know, my parents, they were both teachers, so I'm an educator first and foremost. It's just in the family. And so when it comes to helping people try to heal without looking at themselves through shame, or sometimes unnecessarily putting them in a vulnerable position where they're going to receive shame, to you, like, what are some, you know, suggested modalities for healing or from therapy that you would recommend to people that want to start working on themselves that you might think are better? Because when it comes to therapy, like, no two therapists are the same, and no two strategies of getting therapy are the same. So what are some modalities you would recommend for people?
So I'm a big internal family systems girly. But here's the thing, piggybacking off the concept of shame, internal family systems has a pro shame approach, but not in the way that you think.
Yeah.
So the shame and the criticism, the internalization of shame and criticism, and the propensity to externalize shaming and criticizing onto others is viewed as something that, okay, well, that developed for a reason, right? And so a lot of internal family systems kind of based on this principle can seem kind of paradoxical, where it's like, how do we get to know your shame? How do we get to know your inner critic? How do we get to know the part of you that thinks about killing yourself all the time?
Yeah.
What about the part of you that just goes on like benders? Like, what's that about? You know? But it's all done through the lens of coherence and compassion, right? So it's like creating a space to explore what these parts of you really needed. And as I mentioned earlier, they're probably sick of doing their jobs. Like, and there's a bunch of different ways to kind of process in internal family systems. It's very flexible, not a lot of homework, if any at all.
Yeah.
So shout out to the girlies like me with ADHD who never did their therapy homework. I was just like, I lost it. I don't know. It's in my car somewhere under the seat. I don't know. Probably has coffee spilled on it. Couldn't tell you. DBT, too much homework for me.
Yeah.
I do like DBT though. It's good. It's a good fit for some people. But yeah, I really like these more kind of bottom up modalities for if we're looking at something like attachment insecurity and shame and complex trauma. I think, you know, a responsible therapist will be attuned to you and also not plunge you into the deeper processing without doing what we call like resourcing or like stabilization.
Right.
And so, you know, it's important that you sense that a therapist is meeting you where you are and honoring where you are in the process and not rushing into things to satisfy their own kind of, I want to do this therapy and feel special kind of stuff.
Right.
Because unfortunately, some therapists are like that.
Yeah.
Nobody should be asking you to recount traumatic events if it's re-traumatizing. You shouldn't feel pressured to do anything. I don't know. I have trouble organizing my thoughts about therapy because I truly think there are a lot of like not great therapists out there. And so it's one of those things that I struggle to really relay everything that I think would be empowering in finding a therapist. I just really like the modality of internal family systems, accelerated resolution therapy, EMDR can be really helpful to kind of break through some of these defenses and reach a quicker resolution. Also, don't knock a good old fashioned psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach. They're all kind of working on the same core stuff in different ways at different paces.
Right.
So I think ultimately what matters is that somebody feels safe with their practitioner, that they have a good relationship with the practitioner. Two practitioners with two different personalities and the same approach could elicit very different responses from somebody. And so the relationship is what's really the most important, regardless of what the therapist is doing.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really good to share because, you know, it sometimes takes a lot of people a long time to find a therapist that they really gel with, that they vibe with. And, you know, it takes even longer to build up a repertoire with them, like a cadence, and you get used to how, how you show up in that session and how they work with you during that time. And, speaking of my own personal experience, being in therapy for a little over 2 years now, like even just recently, this last month, my therapist and I discovered a new way for me to start talking about core wounds and issues and trauma through the use of music, right? Like we'll use a song, we'll put on that song and only talk about the issue or the wound during the course of that song, because for me, it helped offer a nice little window to tap into that trauma without feeling overwhelmed, without feeling engulfed.
Mm-hmm.
And once the song wrapped up, we closed it up, move on to the next song, talk about
Mm-hmm.
something else. And that took us over 2 years to get there. Right. And so when it comes to like other people, especially with yourself, you've been in therapy for a very, very long time. Like how can someone tell if like the therapist they're working with is right for them, or how can they tell when they found, I'm not saying how do they know when they found the one, but like, how do they know when they found a good therapist?
I just want to say it's kind of a gut feeling.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. So, like, it was interesting. I was actually driving around today thinking about reaching out to my old therapist to have a kind of tough conversation about some of the stuff that she did that, like, I'm having trouble just letting go of because I felt like it was irresponsible
Mm-hmm.
of her to treat me the way that she did at several points. And I think that's okay. I think I stewed in it a little too long and I wasn't very assertive because I didn't know how to be.
Yeah.
And I think actually kind of listening to my avoidance, the part of me that tells me to run, was really helpful in that instance because I needed that clarity. And then I saw a therapist after that who was a little more affirming, but didn't have some of the training that I wanted to do things like trauma processing. That was like very abstract for some of my medical trauma. I was like, I was passed out. I don't know. I just get really anxious and would like to stop fainting at the doctor, you know. So I'm gonna need some EMDR to get that one sorted
Yeah.
because I just, um, you know. So I still, I really enjoyed my last therapist, and she's a CBT practitioner, but she was still one of the more affirming people that I've ever seen.
Wow.
So that just goes to show it's like not the modality,
Yeah.
but it's how the person shows up. Like she was very, very attuned to me, very affirming of me. And my current therapist, I love her to bits. Like she's just so calm and patient. Also an anxious attacher. Was able to extract that from her. I already knew.
You could
She's a
tell.
Cancer. I already
Yeah.
knew. I was like, girl, July birthday. Yeah, right. uh, not to stereotype. I just think it's fun. um, but yeah, so it's interesting because she is someone who, if like I were to meet her as a friend or a romantic partner, I would probably be like, ugh, bad choice. But as a therapist, it's so interesting because she has a completely different experience of things than I do. And we have this kind of dynamic exploration of things that I find very fascinating and helpful. And again, it's just how I get along with her, how she shows up, and it works. Um, but, I can also look back on experiences where people, I had a therapist who was just straight up emotionally abusive,
Right.
which is unfortunately really common in eating disorder treatment settings. But I would just sit there in groups and be emotionally abused and watch people around me be emotionally abused and have the therapist think that that was working.
Mm.
Um, and that really kind of destroyed part of my adolescence, right? Like I was psychologically just out of sorts after that experience. And so if you ever feel like you're in a relationship with a therapist where they are making you doubt yourself or you are ruminating over the things that they're saying in a way that's causing you distress or they are dismissing or belittling you or not meeting you where you are, like that's a sign that it's probably not a good situation. And so
Right.
I don't want people to be how I was in some of these dynamics, right? Where I just don't say anything and I don't do anything and I just accept that this is how it is. Like, this is therapy. It's like, no, that's not therapy. That's control.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's not healing. That is potentially very harmful to you and your well-being. So Also, people can look up their therapist license and then read the associated code of ethics so they can wonder if they're getting ethical treatment because it's a little uncertain, a little shady out here sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you there. Like, it's not like a one size fits all for
Mm-hmm.
therapists because, like, they're people too. They're imperfect, and many of them have their
Mm-hmm.
own issues and their own baggage and cognitive distortions that can show up in the way that they offer advice and insight. And I think it's really important that you are really advantageous and important that you address the fact that, you know, if a therapist is making you doubt yourself, that to the point where you're feeling distress is a key indicator, right? Because it's one thing for a therapist to challenge you in a session, to get you
Mm-hmm.
to dig deeper into a particular issue or whatever it is you're working through,
Mm-hmm.
but it's another thing to feel like you're being gaslit into believing something
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't inherently feel natural. And so that's usually my advice for some people too, whether it's in a relationship or you're working with a therapist. It's another type of a relationship, right? It's an
Mm-hmm.
ethical relationship, and you know, you really have to trust your instinct. You have to trust your gut, as you
Mm-hmm.
said. And so the last question I wanted to ask, especially as someone who's been working on yourself for a long, long time, how do you know? No judgment whatsoever. Like that's a badge of honor. I think. I think.
No, I also just like my ADHD meds have worn off, so I'm just going clown mode. I could feel it. I was like, oh no,
That's okay.
the drop
Yeah,
off.
well, that's okay. We're close to the end, but I wanted to ask,
Yeah.
like, as someone who's been doing the work for an extended amount of time and has gotten to know themselves in that process, and of course, many different therapists, with someone who wants to do this work and who has been doing it for some time, how would you know when it's time to like step away from therapy? Like, how do you know when it's time to put it off to the side and just live your life, right? Like, when do you know you've reached the end of the amount of work you can do in therapy? Is there an end? Is this even the right question to be asking? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, so like I feel like I am not the majority of therapists when it comes to this, but I think also it's like I work with people with complex trauma and personality issues or like disabled neurodivergent people. Like so it's like there there's always going to be a time and place to explore something.
Right.
Um so it's like I don't like this idea of like get in and get out as fast as possible. Like as long as people are finding the relationship with me beneficial, I don't care. Like I don't care if they're in or not. I would want to explore with them like, the reasons they continue to show up, but I don't have this like kind of medicalized view of like longer term therapy. Like I don't see it as like this inherently bad thing like some people do.
Mm-hmm.
Like we could go down in frequency of visits, touch base here and there. Like, but I think it can be really beneficial if we find somebody that we really enjoy working with
Right.
to have that longer term relationship. And I don't see anything wrong with that. Um, Also, there's this idea that like, people will recognize that it's like time to terminate and like, they may say like, uh, if I were looking to terminate with somebody, I might say like, "Hey, we're not really like talking about a whole lot in here. How would you feel about going down to like twice a month and then maybe once a month?" So that's an option, right? Or sometimes it's like, "Hey, like I noticed like we haven't really been covering a whole lot in here, or we're kind of just talking about the day-to-day stuff that you experience throughout the week. And while I love making space for you and talking about that, I care deeply about you and wondering what that's about."
Right.
Because sometimes a whole mountain of chaos under there,
Yeah, exactly.
you know. And that can be an avoidance strategy. And that's where I do come back to some of these more like psychoanalytic or psychodynamic principles of like analyzing what's going on in the here and now. Like, hey, I noticed like when you're here, this is all we talk about. What's going on there?
Yeah.
Or like, I noticed that you constantly do this thing when you're here with me. Like, can we check out what's going on there? you know?
Mm-hmm.
Or like I'm feeling like you're pushing me away a little bit. Like that's stuff that I will bring into the room, and I do find that valuable all the way back to like the kind of origins of psychotherapy, like doing the here and now work and analyzing what's going on in the relational context. And, if people are finding benefit in that type of work longer term, or just that source of support, like I don't see a reason to force somebody to terminate. And I think obviously if people want to terminate, like they're allowed to do so.
Right.
Like I'm not trying to hold people hostage, or pathologize them and make them believe that they'll never be able to exist without me. I ideally want to hand them tools to go out into the world and do what they need to do. Um, but I just know also, like, I don't want people to feel like they can't see a therapist as long as they derive benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, that's not up to me. That's not my choice. That's the client's choice. But yeah, if like you're finding like you're going to therapy every week, you're like, well, on Wednesday I did this, and then the weekend was nice. There, you might want to touch base with your therapist and like, am I avoiding something?
Mm.
Am I, is there something I need to be doing? Or like, I actually feel like I met my treatment goals and I actually might want to go down to twice a month.
Right.
And then can we check in after like a month or so of that and see how that's going? Like, there's so many ways to handle that. It's really subjective, but I never want people to feel like, especially because we're talking in the context of insecure attachment, that like
Right.
they have to rush out the door,
Mm-hmm.
or anything like that. Those are things that take quite a long time to really address and heal, especially on the more severe ends, or in my case, like with a personality disorder. I'm a lifer, so
Mm-hmm.
that's fine.
Yeah, I love that answer.
I'm also a therapist, so I should never not be in therapy as a therapist. Like, just
Exactly.
be clear.
There's the other side of that too,
Yeah.
right? And I love that answer. And this is exactly why I wanted to have you on the show, because I knew no matter what question I asked, it wouldn't just be a straight answer. There's nuance there. And I love
Is that because I'm
nuance.
queer?
It could be. It could be. You never know. Like,
There's no straight answers from me.
it's never a simple yes or no, this or that, not black and white. There's all that gray and color in between. And I love that. And so it's really great because it shows that like we don't have to think about therapy in the old way that we once used to. And like even speaking on what it's like here in Canada, like for a lot of people who are trying to get into therapy, many of them have access to that through their work. However, through their company's insurance, it only allocates a number of sessions for them to go to therapy for a particular issue. And there's the idea that during that time, that issue is going to be resolved. And to me, that's a really flawed way of thinking about seeking treatment, because it's really medicinal in that sense. It's really like, you know, clean in and out, and you go back to work and you're healed and you're clean. But it's like, it's not like that for a lot of people. This is a lifelong thing. There's going to be seasons, and there's going to be times where these challenges are really present in your life and you need more support. And then other times where life is great and, you know, you're just coasting and you don't need as much support during that time. And I like the nuanced answer you gave, because it allows for a lot of flexibility. It allows for people to look at therapy with, of course, no shame, and the amount that they get doesn't determine their worth or their value or even the progress that they're making, right? It's really about what you get out of it, the rate at which you're comfortable diving into that. And, you know, you also got to manage the financial aspect of it too. What can you afford every month, right? If that's how often you're going. And I really love that answer, because there's a really still a present or prevalent medicinal take on seeking support, that you need to go for a set amount of time and you can't leave until you're perfectly healed. Whereas for the great majority of us, these are lifelong things. It's the idea of healing is just a state of mind. It's not a quality of body or anything like that, right? And so I appreciate that so much. So is there anything else you wanted to
just in
add?
case, like, I was just going to say, like, listen, I am a licensed mental health professional. I have 90 minutes of trauma therapy every week, and I have another hour of ADHD therapy every week, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, fuck being perfect. Like, if your needs are your needs, Like, I need trauma therapy. And I also, as a late diagnosed ADHD person, need a lot of ADHD support.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just out here spinning so many plates and they're all falling on the ground. And I'm like, this makes me a bad person. I'm like, no, that's the link between the ADHD and trauma, and we're not doing it anymore.
Yeah.
I need what I need, and that's okay. I can access those things right now, and that's okay. There's no time limit.
Exactly.
The time is actually overdue, because if these things happened earlier, I probably would be in better shape. So it makes sense that I have to catch up now.
Yeah.
It's like we're allowed to just need therapy. We don't have to be better in 12 sessions either.
Exactly.
Like,
it's the equivalent of having like a gym membership for your mind and your spirit and soul, where it can just be a regular part of your life. It doesn't have to be this thing that you're going for specific help, or this challenge that you don't want to open up with about people. Like, it's just a normal part of your life, and you have that support. Because, you know, one of the things I've been learning a lot more as I've been learning about polyamorous relationships is sometimes you need different types of people in your lives to get a certain sort of value out of those relationships, rather than thinking your romantic partner is your husband or wife, or they're your friend and your hobbyist, but they're also your therapist. It's like, no, you can have very specific people in your life for very specific things. And I think that's a really great way to look at life in general when it comes to the context of like why you need therapy. It doesn't have to be because you're at the edge of the cliff, or you're at the end of your rope. It can just be a part of just living in this crazy world we have right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Just be a part of the ecosystem of your life.
Yeah.
A healthy ecosystem is a diverse ecosystem.
Exactly. I love that. Yeah. So to wrap things up, you know, Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really insightful connecting with you. And I knew when I was inviting you on the show, there's going to be a lot of rich conversation, and you definitely delivered that. So for the viewers and listeners, please share what you're doing at the moment. Do you have any projects? What are you working on? And how can people connect with you on social media to follow you?
So, projects, not a lot. Like I said, I'm taking some time off. I'm about to go back to grad school, different grad school for a different type of therapy practice.
Amazing.
So I'm kind of biding my time until then. But I actually am going to be launching a Patreon in the next couple weeks, where I'll be doing some deeper dives, more nuanced takes on a lot of these topics that we kind of covered today: personality disorders, things like trauma, complex trauma, ADHD, all of that stuff. Super excited. I'm starting out with John Bowlby's attachment and an overview of attachment, because we got to start at the foundation.
The basics,
okay?
right?
Like, we're laying a strong foundation for the rest of the concepts to build on. So I'm actually really excited about that. I have the energy in me to do these things again. But yeah, like, other than that, that's what I'm working on right now, as I am focusing on my own healing as well. But if you want to find me on social media, I am so far only on TikTok at, what's my at? Oh my gosh, at Andy Lynn Evans, which I'm sure Charlie will be so polite and link for everybody.
Yeah, no worries there. I'll definitely make sure to link that in the descriptions and the comments. And for people on TikTok, this will be included in every single video I share there. But of course, you know, if people follow you, they'll be able to get the link to your Patreon when that goes live on your TikTok page there as well. I'm sure you'll be having a bit of a marketing push for that too, to announce that, which is exciting.
I'll be trying. Catch me typing out Patreon in elite speed.
That's awesome.
So it doesn't get flagged by the algorithm.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to see that come to life. And it's great you're using a platform such as Patreon to share that knowledge, because again, there's a lot of people that don't have access to therapy. And, you know, people like yourself, they're, as I said, doing the Lord's work. You're making people's lives easier. You're creating so much deep value for a lot of people. And I'm really glad that you agreed to join the show today. So, Andrea, thank you so much. To all of the viewers and watchers and listeners, I hope you gained some value and insight from our conversation. Of course, I'll link Andrea's socials in the description. Until next time, happy healing, and thank you for joining.